So let me start with a quick introduction about myself so you can understand where I'm coming from when I'm talking about software development and why is a lawyer coming here to talk to you about software development. So I work at Hitachi System Security. We are a division of Hitachi that is located in Canada, Quebec. Here's the French accent. I'm a director of legal and compliance. I'm a data protection officer. So my job at Hitachi is to make sure that we process personal information in compliance with all the applicable regulations, and even that we go beyond, above industry standard to make sure that we respect the rights and freedom of our users. And I do other boring stuff like contracts and the likes. I want to start this discussion about some general discussion about the economy in general. So this is a picture of the biggest economy in the world. Walmart in 2016 was the 10th biggest economy in the world, bigger economy than Australia, India, or South Korea. Today, in 2018, you're looking at economies like Facebook, Twitter, Uber, that are built on data. So that raises an interesting question. How much is data worth? That may seem like a silly question, but Forbes looked into it in 2015, and they found that companies like Facebook, if you look at their actual worth, and if you look at their market valuation, they are actually worth more on the market than you can look in their, if you open their accounting book, they're not even worth as much as you feel they are worth on the trade exchange. Because there's one asset that is not accounted for, and that is data. So data has a value. You could even say data is the new gold. The accountants today are actually looking at how they can change the general accounting practices to take into consideration that value of data so that when we do merger and acquisition, we can actually have better measures of what we are buying. So today, data is not accounted for in the books, but data is the new gold. And that typically comes with a particular dynamic. So when we have a new resources that has so much value, there's three things that generally happen. First, you have these big giant companies that eventually abuse of that resource. You've seen Cambridge Analytica. So you have that, we had that in the environment, we had that if you look back in history, that's something that's typically happened. And as a reaction, rightly so, governments will do regulation, like the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. And that will create a compliance burden for all the companies around the world, even those that are sometimes too small to follow these standards. And that raises some question in terms of ethics and technological development that we can call Techno Ethics. So the Greek used to refer to techno as techne, and for them, technology was supposed to be something that serves the natural world, that supports it. And that raises the question of, is this what we're doing today? Are we building technology to support the natural world, or are we building technology that are ultimately not even good for the natural world? And the natural world is you, it's me, and it's the planet. It's our rights and freedom. That's why we have technologies. So we need sometimes to stop and say, are we developing this in a sustainable manner? Are we developing it for the human being? Or are we developing technologies for the entities? Are we developing it just for economical purposes? And it's not going to get better. If we're asking these questions today, we're asking them already late, but at the same time, the future is now. Look at this. We have huge amount of information, big data. We have the Internet of Things. It is just starting. It's in your house, it's in your city, and it will be in your body soon. We have blockchain technology that we're just beginning to understand, so there's a big buzz around it. But how many people really understand what it does, or how can it affect our privacy? A very few people. I don't know many experts that can look into how blockchain complies with GDPR and come up with a useful answer to this. And that raises two new areas of compliance. We have data that is worth a lot of money. We have these ethical questions, so naturally people will come forward trying to protect it. Over the last years, there have been different approaches. So we saw cybersecurity as a compliance field that emerged mostly out of economical reasons. Companies wanted to protect their assets. They didn't want to be subject to intellectual property theft. And as they grew bigger, they realized that these lawsuits could be very costly. So now it was affecting their reputational damages, and it was going beyond the economical realm. So today, these companies are addressing cybersecurity from a compliance and legal perspective, but that's not where it started. And that raises another area of compliance that we know today as privacy. So privacy and security are very similar. They overlap in many respects, but they're not the same. Privacy approaches the security of data, not just any data, data about you, data about me, and it approaches it from a human right perspective. So it asks the question of whether we are processing personal data in a way that protects our human right and does not hinder our human right. So they complement each other. In many respects, they overlap with each other, but there are two different approaches to a fairly similar problem. And that is because processing personal information can lead to many problems: discrimination, profiling, surveillance, undemocratic control on freedom of speech. These are just examples of what you could see if you open the newspaper today. It's interesting that Germany today has probably the most stringent privacy laws in the world. Why do you think that is? Because they grew out of a war where there was control over information, surveillance, and eventually it was used against the people. And they learned from that, and they don't want that again. So they have good privacy laws. They have 13 data protection authorities only in Germany. So for any business that want to do, any enterprise that want to do business in Germany and in the European Union, you need to approach not only security, but privacy. And in order to do this, you will need a new critical set of skills that is called privacy by design. You will need it to be able to speak legal, technical, and ethical in the same sentence if you want to conquer new markets, if you want to have new business opportunities, keep your customer, and keep their trust. So obviously, the General Data Protection Regulation is one of the examples of privacy by design being part of a regulation. It probably took the concept and made it extremely popular. You have Article 25.1 that requires that an entity takes adequate measure. So it's a risk-based approach. You look at the cost, you look at the state-of-the-art technology, you look at the nature of your processing, the type of data that you're processing, and how much data you're processing, and you need to come up with controls to ensure that you have built a system that by design from the very start is privacy compliance and protects the individual. 25.2 goes further. It asks you that by default, your application, your software, or your IT system has that privacy setting. So for example, if I open an application and it's asked, Vanessa, do you want to turn off data sharing? That's not how it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be off by default, and if I want to share, I have to go in and turn that on. Now, I know how to do that. I don't think my grandmother knows how to do that. I don't think my parents know how to do that. And I don't think kids know how to do that. Actually, I think the amount of people who know how to change their setting, it's actually very, very small. So we need to give these people some measure of protection. That's why the law is asking businesses to do it by default. So that's why the GDPR today, it's a big compliance challenge, and it brought privacy by design to the front line. And when I talk about privacy by design, I talk about making sure that your software allows for lawful, fair, transparent processing. These are all privacy principles you find in the GDPR, and you tell me it's also common sense, right? You make sure that it's secure, that you don't store data more longer than you need to. Why would you want to do that? It's not good for you, it's not good for your users. If you don't need the data, let it go. Accuracy. If you're building a file about me, about my medical history, I would like you not to make a mistake. What if it's a criminal file and I get sued on this because you're profiling on me, but this is the wrong person? Accuracy is very important when you're doing big data and when you're doing profiling or monitoring. So what we do as a business in Hitachi System Security, we monitor employees to make sure that they don't create security incident. Imagine if we made an error and that person lost his job. It's extremely important. Purpose limitation. Why am I collecting the data? Here's your answer, stick to it. If you don't have any reason to collect the data, just don't. Because it's not good for your entity, it's not good for your user. The more data you have, the more costly the data breach will be. And ultimately, your products need to serve the rights and freedom of people. So if they have the right to data portability, if they have the right to consent, you need to put some functionalities in there for them to be able to activate this right. You can't expect people to call your company. For example, if somebody would call Hitachi tomorrow, they probably would have a very hard time finding me at Hitachi and say, Vanessa, can you delete all my history? It will be complicated, where you have the opportunity of doing this directly in your application, directly into your software. And that is privacy by design. So you're probably asking, why is a Canadian coming here to talk to me about GDPR? Well, here's the thing. Privacy by design is actually a Canadian, it's a Canadian invention. It was invented by Anne Cavoukian, who's a doctor. She is the chair of the Privacy by Design Foundation at Ryerson University. She was the Information and Privacy Commissioner of Ontario, Canada. And she summed up privacy by design into 7 foundational principles, which I find are extremely clear to follow and make sense. Be proactive, not reactive. Don't wait for something bad to happen. Make sure something bad doesn't happen. Privacy is the default setting. We discussed this before. Privacy embedded into design. So from the planning phase, you need to think about privacy. And full functionality. Obviously, I'm not asking you to build software that are inefficient. I'm asking you to build a software that is efficient and privacy-centric. And by the end of this presentation, I think I will give you tools so you are able to do that. End-to-end security. There is no privacy without security. Visibility and transparency. When I'm using my app, when I'm using a system or a software, I should be empowered to understand what is happening with my personal information. They belong to me. And respect for user privacy. Users are the people that keep your business alive. You do product for them, not to exploit them. And that raises a lot of questions when you talk about privacy. I know I have questions, maybe you have too, and maybe by the end of this presentation you will have even more. Some of the questions I ask myself when I think about privacy by design is technology intrinsically good or bad? Are there technologies that are intrinsically intrusive? What are the responsibilities of tech companies in developing services and products that respect the fundamental rights of individuals? How can lawyers and technical people work together over this? Is there a demand for new critical skills? Is privacy by design a compliance requirement, or is it just an opportunity for competitive innovation? Who is to be accountable for privacy by design development? Companies, developers, lawyers? And how will the court articulate liability if we do not follow that methodology? But beyond that compliance requirement, let's forget about privacy by design being a legal requirement, a part of GDPR. In itself, it is extremely beneficial for your company to consider privacy by design. For one thing, it will allow you to have a methodology that will integrate security and privacy requirements, or if you talk to a software developer, you would say functional and non-functional requirement. And that will allow you to have an approach to take this requirement and put them into a logical methodology that will make you accountable for what you do. So you will be able not only to do it, but demonstrate that you're doing it to your users, to the courts, to your boss. Make sure that what you are doing can be repeatable. It will allow you to implement a risk-based approach. That's not the first time you hear about this. NIST as a risk management framework. Almost any cybersecurity association today is pushing for a risk-based approach. There is no way you can decide which controls you need if you have not looked at the vulnerabilities and threats that your system is creating. And lastly, it will also give you the means to manage your platform on the long run. So there will be no new vulnerabilities once your software is out. There will be zero-day exploit. There will be new threats that were not there when it was created. So once your software is out, you still need to manage it. You still need to make sure that it is secure and up to the industry-based standard. Here's my personal advice. Don't just look at the law as a baseline. The laws will change. They will become more stringent. Look at the state of the art and see if you can afford that. If the answer is yes, go for it. And the reason for that is that privacy by design is a competitive edge. It will allow you to go into the European market with your software, sit down in front of a CISO and tell him, this is a software that is GDPR compliant and certified as such. This is hard to beat because there's not many out there. So in itself, it's also a critical skill that is marketable as an individual. You can go to a new company and say, I know how to build software, but also I know how to build software that are compliant with the law, that are privacy by design. So there's a lot that, in terms of privacy by design, the software developers play a critical role. They will make ethical decisions that will affect all of us, our children, our society. And do we do enough to explain to them what do we expect from a compliance perspective, from a privacy perspective, and from a security perspective? There are success stories. I am not preaching something that was never done before. There are browser today, like your popular browser, like Google, etc. They allow you to activate do not track technology. This is what we call a privacy enhancing technology. These technologies were created before privacy by design. So today, they can be used by developers as building blocks that you can integrate into your software development. If that is of interest to you, ENISA has done in 2014 a report of the best privacy enhancing technologies out there and has suggested methodologies of how we can evaluate whether they're good or not. As software developers, you need to know, like, these are easy grabbing building blocks. You don't need to start from scratch every time you build a software. So the European Data Protection Board, that is the entity that is in charge of applying the GDPR. They said that to them, privacy by design was first a good planning. So it all starts with planning. It means that you don't go into production with something you have not planned before. Second, it means you need a risk-based approach. Why? And that brings me to my third point, because you need to identify controls that will address this risk. Those that are familiar with security, we use the term threats and vulnerabilities. We can't use that with privacy, because there's a lot of actions that are not necessarily considered threats, but that are problematic from a privacy standpoint. So a consent that is not informed is not really a threat from a security standpoint, but it is a problematic data action. So when we approach privacy, we approach it slightly different. So the fact that privacy and security are similar does not mean that we need an identical approach. This was recognized by NIST, so they amended their risk management framework to include a privacy management framework, and they suggested terms that were more adequate to them. So having do your planning, having do your risk-based approach, and identify the controls, you need to make sure they're implemented, and you need to monitor this. So these are the 4 principles of privacy by design that I'm summarizing here, about 100 pages in 4 words, but you get the point. It's a management approach. And that is nothing different than what we know as software development life cycle. So for those of you that work in software engineering, you know this. The key point here is that you need phases. You need an organized approach. And I know a lot of people today, a lot of software developers are working around with the agile methodology. That doesn't mean you don't have phases. That means that you're going back and forth between phases more often using cycles. That's fine. Whether you use this or a waterfall methodology, it's all fine, but you need to make sure you have sufficient planning and sufficient iterations between the phases so that nothing goes into production without sufficient testing. And all of this documented, because if you get sued, you need to be able to show this happen. So that's why when I go to client place and say, I do all of this, Vanessa, don't worry. I say, okay, show me. And that's usually where things start to crumble apart. We have a lot of general policies in companies. I'm not so much interested into general policies. I'm interested into processes, evidences that these processes are being followed, that they are understood by everyone, and in particular, the developers. At Hitachi System for Security, we follow these 5 phases. We look at planning, we look at encoding. And when I talk about encoding, it's not just encode everything or just anything. You have to do it in a secure manner, in a way that is documented. You have to do secure code reviews. You have to look at your source code and make sure that what you have built, what you have coded in there is actually secure. So you don't just do anything just to follow the phases. Every phase comes with its own set of processes. Then come testing. This is not where you want to go faster and test a little less. I think we had that conversation with somebody yesterday. Somebody was telling to me, my team was trying to save money, so they were trying to bypass the testing phase. It's not the phase you want to bypass. Actually, none of them you want to bypass. You don't just let go of a software that was not tested. That means to do intrusion detection. That means to do vulnerability assessment, to do it internally. And if you can, if you have the financial means to do so, with a third party that is independent. You need segregation of duty. The person who created the software is not the right person to test the software. This person has too much in the game, has too much skin in the game. So we know human nature as it is. You need to look for your quality assessment team. And then you deploy. again, you don't just do it and hope for the best. You do it in a systematic manner, an organized manner, and you measure the success of your deployment. And then you manage your platform. So when you're managing your platform, you want to make sure that you have a systematic approach, an organized approach to make sure that it is tested regularly, reviewed regularly, and not just when it's the end of the month or when it's, you have an extra $10,000 in your budget. It has to be planned. For fiscal year 2019, here are the security measures that I will implement to make sure that my software remains secure given what we know this fiscal year 2019 about new threats. Planning and design is probably one of the most important phase and overlooked phase. This is where you need to go get your privacy expert, your lawyers, sit them in the room and say, listen to what I want to do. What do you think about it? Typically, we start that conversation around data mapping. So I need to see on a map, and it looks like this. So obviously, that's not a real case example. But I need to see on a map, where is my personal information going? Where is it at rest? Where is it at use? And where is it encrypted? Otherwise, as a data protection officer, it's very difficult for me to advise as to whether you have the right controls in place. I need to see that road that you're taking, and I want to make sure that there's no warning on that road. Once I have that road, then we can look at the risk. And when I look at the risk, I look at the worst case scenario. Assuming you have zero control in place, this is what could happen. And then you say, okay, what control do I need to address that critical situation? So you don't start from the assumption that you have controls. You start from the assumption that this is what happens if I don't touch nothing. This is my project. I want to take all the health data from this population and process it. What could happen? Well, if there's a data breach, it can be dangerous because people have a high expectation of privacy. Okay, what do I need to address this? This is the conversation you need to have with your lawyers. It's a conversation you need to have with your privacy expert. And this is why this is an interdisciplinary conversation where you will need to speak legal and they will need to speak technical. And this is not easy. Actually, NIST has conducted a study, and they say one of the major problems they have with articulating privacy is the lack of communication between technical people and legal people. I always say, if I ask software developer to do a software that is transparent, that means nothing to them. So I need to find better words, words that they can actually translate into binary codes, words that translate into functionalities. And as a data protection officer, I have to make the sufficient research. I have to turn myself into somebody technical if I want results. And this is an example of how you can do it. Accountability can become predictability. So predictability and accountability are both meta-objective. So objectives that are kind of a background to all the other objectives. You want to be able to say you're doing something and demonstrate that you're doing something and make sure that it's always doing what you say you're doing. So that's predictability, which makes a lot more sense to software engineers than accountability. That is not a technical term. You can look at manageability and say that data minimization could be articulated through manageability. That means don't over-collect, that's not manageable, right? So these are examples of requirements. We talk about predictability, manageability, dissociability. And if you look into NIST, and you can look, there are many methodologies online that are suggesting some criteria that you can look into it, like unlinkability, for example. What's important is to develop a glossary in your company to make sure that you are understood, and that vice versa as well, right? It goes both ways. So lawyers need to understand that, but software engineers always have to do their extra step to explain what they do so that we can actually be useful. So I'm very lucky because I was allowed to use our own software as a case study. It's a software that is not, well, we are actually a Archangel 5.0 software on the market, and we're going to release next month Archangel 6.0, which we like to call next gen. We like to call it like that because instead of trying to do reverse engineering of our engine to make sure it fits new legal requirements, we basically built it from scratch. So I was involved in every step of the way, so this is how I can come up today with this methodology and this advice. So in order for you to understand, Archangel is that little logo you can see in the middle. It's a software, it's a log correlation software. Here how it works. We have Arc Edge that are basically little sensors that connect logs from various points. So we are able with Arc Edge to collect logs from the clouds, from ATM machines, from the OT sector, or most traditionally from our client's network. We take all that information, and all these logs that we get are from controls that you have in place. Your antivirus, your firewall, they speak, but they speak a lot. And they have sometimes more than 1 million logs in a day, so that's a lot of information to understand. So that's why we built Archangel. That information goes into Arc Lake, which is like a repository. And it goes on in the Hitachi correlation engine, which is NextGen. NextGen takes all of this data about all the controls of all our clients. We have a big privacy problem here, because all of these logs have a lot of information that we don't even control. Sometimes we tell our client, why are you collecting this? But we don't get to control what's in the logs. We can have sometimes credit cards number, social security number. We definitely have IP, host names. So that's a problem when we sat down, we say, how do we manage that extraordinary amount of personal information that we are collecting, which we need to collect for security purposes, right? So manage security purposes, the whole point is for that correlation engine to come out and say, uh-oh, I have an incident. So that's a legitimate interest of a business. And that incident, then we escalate to the clients. But we want to make sure that we're doing this in the most respect of privacy as possible, that we are not doing false judgment or inaccurate judgment about the employees that we're monitoring. And we want to make sure, even though we have amazing employees, we trust them, we do background screening, we want to make sure that the information that they get, all of this information, they don't get it in plain view. So one of the challenges we face in doing this is that in order for us to be able to still do our job, but obfuscate the data, we needed to do it at the cell level. Traditional database, schema-less database system, allows you to do obfuscation, encryption, and the like, but on a row level, on a relational aspect. So you can have, let's say, the whole file about Vanessa Henri that is obfuscated, but you can't obfuscate just half of my name. And that's a problem because we needed to do that in order to be GDPR compliant. And we wanted to be not only GDPR compliant, we wanted to be certified. So we looked into Accumulo, which is another database that allowed us to do cell-level security and cell-level obfuscation. So that's not easy to do because Accumulo, it's more difficult to manage. It took time, and you want to make sure you're not affecting the operational ability of your software either. But we did it. And that's what it looks like, cell-level security. I can pick what I need to hide, which means that my analysts can still look at security incident, escalate them, but don't see things they don't need to see. So if they need to see, for example, the IP address, because they need to know where it's coming from, they probably don't need to see the credit card number in there. That allowed us to do data viewing permissions that we couldn't do before with our software. So the data owner is the client, and you have different security analyst level of permission that the client can freely assign. And it looks like this. When data is visible and clear, they see all of this. But then, with the role-based access control, they see just specific part of it, and the client have control over this. And we can do data anonymization, which allows us to be way more secure than we used to be. So closing down on this, I'd like us to reflect on how privacy is a multidisciplinary approach between law, sociology, information security, ethics, and economics, and how each of us, with our different background, can contribute to this. Because we need to let that sink in, that we are building technologies that will affect our kids, that will affect our future. And we want to make sure that the technologies that we're building, we are building it for the users. We are building it for the individuals, for their rights and freedom, and we are socially responsible into what we do. Thank you.